Most of us are pretty good at making excuses, aren't we? I don't know how. I didn't quite understand what it was that you said. I couldn't find the right tools. Oh, that one escaped. I missed that one. I have a doctor's appointment. There's been a death in the family. I have an auntie coming in from Melbourne and I need to pick her up at the airport. Now, in the Christian world, we can find all sorts of excuses for choosing to not respond to God's call upon our life. That's the pastor's job. That's not my gifting. I've already had a turn at doing that. Let someone else do it. Here's a good one. I'm too busy. What about I'm too tired? I'm too old, or I'm too young. Jeremiah had every excuse ready when God called him to be a prophet. I wonder if his excuses are perhaps our excuses for not hearing and responding to God's voice when he calls. That job is too big for me. You've got the wrong one here, Lord. Jeremiah was called to be a prophet to the nations, not a priest like his father and grandfather. He was actually called out of the comfort zone that he had known. Now, we often think of prophets as people who can tell us what will happen in the future. But a prophet was chosen and, if you like, became an authorised spokesperson for God, and they declared God's word to the people. A prophet was more of a forth-teller than they were foretellers, for they highlighted the people's sin and they called them back to a loving God. Now, being a prophet was much more challenging than simply serving as a priest. Now, the priest's duties were quite routine. Everything was written down in the law. They performed rituals, sacrifices, offerings, and they led services. A prophet, on the other hand, never knew from one day to the next what the Lord may call him to say or do. God may assign you a task, and often seems to be a demanding task. Now, you can say to yourself, I can never do that. That's not for me. A bit out of my league, really. Actually, it's way beyond me. But have you ever noticed how God often stretches us? There's an old saying that ships in the harbour are safe, but that's not what ships are built for. Jeremiah felt that he didn't have it as a public speaker. He felt below par. By the way, that same excuse was shared by Moses and possibly many of us as well. But in Jeremiah 1:6 we read this, Oh Lord, I don't know how to speak. I'm only a youth. God has a way of overcoming our weaknesses and our inadequacies, doesn't he? I've observed over the years that those people who are aware of their own shortcomings are usually the people who are most dependent upon God's all-sufficiency. His strength is made perfect in our weakness. His glory shines through our flaws. Our abilities may seem on the surface to fall short, but God always equips those whom he calls. Did you hear that? If God calls, he equips. Now, each of us have the promise of God's provision. Just look what happened to Jeremiah. And we read in 1:9 that the Lord reached out his hand, touched his mouth, and told him, I have now filled your mouth with my words. God doesn't always use the so-called silver-tongued, well-spoken orator, but he often uses the faithful one whose tongue has been touched by God. Personally, at those moments when I feel inadequate, I'm reminded of the 12 disciples that Jesus called together to share ministry with. What a crew. Yet Jesus, as he led them, they changed the world. Ordinary people charged with an ordinary task. But when Jesus is in the mix, that's when the difference is made. Another excuse sometimes used is the timing's not quite right. When I'm a little older, it might be better. Jeremiah complained to God, I'm only young. Now, most scholars think that Jeremiah was around 20 to 25 at the time of his call. He felt as though he wasn't up to par. He felt a bit green and he was intimidated by the size of the job which God was calling him to. I have a saying that I've used over the years that opportunities more often than not come at the most inopportune times. God's call may come at an inopportune time, but his timing is always perfect. God's timing is impeccable. And we know that he never sends us out alone. We have the promise of God's presence. The Lord replied, don't say I'm too young. For you must go wherever I send you and say whatever I tell you. And don't be afraid of the people, for I will be with you and I will protect you. I, the Lord, have spoken. Did you notice that promise? Before Jeremiah could experience God's fullness, his presence, he had to go where God would send him. He had to say what God would want him to say, and he had to do away with any fear. This is one of those put your foot in the water and see moments. Step out in faith, friend. It's been said that when God calls us to an assignment, he doesn't just give us a roadmap to follow and leave us to our own resources. Rather, he walks with us. His presence gives us strength to stand firm and steady no matter what. Now, God was expecting immediate action from Jeremiah because this is what he said. Now get ready. Stand up and tell them everything that I command you. God called Jeremiah to action. He was called to go out amongst the people. He was called to deliver an important message. It wasn't a feel-good message, but it was a necessary message because the people had wandered off course from God. Jeremiah was not on his own in his calling, and neither are we. So do not be intimidated by them, or I will cause you to cower before them, God said to Jeremiah. Immediate obedience is the only appropriate response when God calls. We have the promise of God's power. Do you know that God has something for you to do? God has an assignment for you. Maybe it's as simple as praying for that person whose name just popped into your mind. It could be that you need to call someone or call on them. Remember that you are never on your own. The words of that wonderful old hymn remind us to trust and obey, for there is no other way but to be happy, but to trust in Jesus. Trust in him today and be blessed as you journey.